search for a justice. President Trump has interviewed several candidates for the opening on the Supreme Court. We have reaction and analysis. Short of the goal, the missing boys soccer team in Thailand is found alive, but they're not home just yet. We have the latest. Pushing back, NATO allies disagree with President Trump on a key issue ahead of their summit next week. And sound the alarm. What makes the Vatican's Fire Department a little different from most. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 3rd, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The White House says President Trump will not ask potential Supreme Court nominees about their desire to overturn Roe v. Wade. The abortion debate has become a focal point in the search for a new justice. President Trump says he will announce his pick on Monday. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The president published a list of more than 24 names he would consider for the Supreme Court. Now attention is zeroing in on a handful of candidates he has interviewed in person. Each conservative could reshape the court for generations. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders tells journalists what type of person President Trump wants to fill the high court seat.
He's looking for somebody with tremendous intellect. He'd like somebody with the right judicial temperament.
The president has personally spoken with several candidates.
I interviewed and met with 4 potential justices of our great Supreme Court. They are outstanding people.
Those 4 federal appellate court judges, Amul Thapar, Raymond Kethledge, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett. They come from a list of 25 candidates the president has been considering, approved by pro-lifers like Marjorie Dannenfelser, head of the Susan B. Anthony list. She heaps praise on President Trump. By adding pro-life judges to the nation's lower courts, she says he's reforming the judiciary at a record pace. And she goes even further.
He is the most pro-life president in history, and he will do more.
But Monday, as the focus shifted to who the president would select for the Supreme Court, White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders wasn't being as candid.
The president is pro-life.
The future of the nation's abortion laws are on the line. The White House steering clear of any contention ahead of what will likely be a hotly contested confirmation hearing for whomever the president nominates.
Is the president still committed to appointing pro-life judges?
As the president said last week, he's not going to talk to judges about specific cases.
Would the president like to see Roe v. Wade overturned?
Once again, I'm not going to get into any specifics that we would be looking at.
Some reports are circulating that President Trump likes the idea of nominating a conservative woman to the high court. That increases speculation that Judge Amy Barrett, a Roman Catholic, mother of 7, and former Notre Dame law professor, could be rising to the top. Wyatt?
Mark, when does the president plan to interview other candidates?
The White House says he plans to meet with a few more people this week, and they say yesterday he spoke on the phone with Republican Senator Mike Lee. Lee is the one candidate on the president's list of potential nominees who is not a judge. Wyatt?
White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. As President Trump considers his next Supreme Court pick, pro-life groups rush to make their voices heard, and they'll spring into action as soon as the name is revealed to make sure that person is confirmed. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us with more. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Wyatt. Yeah, there's lots of speculation about one name on President Trump's shortlist, Amy Barrett. She's one of the candidates Democratic leader Chuck Schumer has even spoken out against. Conservatives rally in support of this Catholic judge.
The dogma lives loudly within you, and that's of concern.
That challenge last year launched Notre Dame law professor Amy Coney Barrett to national prominence. The words have become a rallying cry, now emblazoning cups, shirts, and editorials. Conservative Catholic Ramesh Panuru writes, "So pick Barrett, Mr. President. Let the dogma live loudly on the Supreme Court."
Amy Barrett would be great.
David Christensen lobbies for the Family Research Council. Well, the conservative Christian group's pillars also happen to be the pillars of this Supreme Court debate.
Look, the president put out a very transparent list of really solid possible candidates to the Supreme Court. Some are better than others, but we're confident the president's going to pick somebody who's going to uphold the Constitution and who's going to be good on the life issue.
And this week, Democratic leader Chuck Schumer launches a preemptive strike against Barrett, tweeting, "If chosen as the nominee, she will be the deciding vote to overturn Roe v. Wade." Christensen says Schumer is unfairly prejudging Barrett, as senators on both sides of the aisle this fall face the judgment of voters.
We think it also is going to have a political signal. You know, this is a midterm election year, and you know, getting the base motivated and conservatives, whether they be Catholic, evangelicals, out there to vote their convictions, that's really important in a democracy, and we think that's part of the process.
Congress is on their July 4th recess, so today it's very quiet here. But when the president makes his pick Monday, the senators will be back, and these spaces behind me will be jammed with cameras. Here, senators will be talking and talking about making a decision that could impact generations to come. Wyatt?
Jason, in the meantime, what else are pro-life groups doing right now on this issue?
Well, Priests for Life today is launching a campaign. They're urging the Senate to confirm the still unnamed nominee. They're also calling on the faithful to pray.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. And joining me now is Adam White, research fellow at the Hoover Institute. And he's also professor at George Mason University's Scalia Law School. Adam, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We just heard from our Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi talking about the potential nominee, Judge Amy Barrett, who's been challenged by Democrats because of her religious beliefs. If she's the nominee, and I know it's still just an if, do you see that same kind of questioning repeating during confirmation hearings, and could that actually energize the base, if you will?
Well, her experience in her Seventh Circuit nomination hearing obviously galvanized her supporters and her critics. I think this time around, if she were the nominee, I think both sides would learn from the experience. I think her critics would become more subtle in their attacks, but not more pointed, but just as pointed.
Mm-hmm. So President Trump is expected to select a justice from the same list where he chose Neil Gorsuch. How is the social and political climate right now, as opposed to, a year later, as opposed to when he picked Gorsuch?
Well, this confirmation hearing would be the most explosive in a generation, regardless of when it occurs, precisely because of the justice being replaced. But the fact that it's happening right now in what may well be the most poisonous political year of recent memory, I think means we're in for something truly, truly explosive.
So how could it influence the confirmation process?
Well, I think the political heat on all sides will be ratcheted up. Everybody understands the stakes of replacing Justice Kennedy. I think Democrat supporters are going to demand real obstruction of this nomination by whatever tools necessary. Although the Democrats don't have many tools at their disposal, they're going to have to get creative.
What assurances do you think, now switching to what the conservatives would want, what assurances do you think conservatives would want in a nominee? What issues, what are the big things?
Well, the court handles so many different issues, but obviously people are focused a lot on the Supreme Court's recent work in expanding the right to abortion, the right to same-sex marriage, and so on. I think for the new nominee, the question is, will you stop expanding those rights? And then there's the second question of what to do with precedents already on the books, either in terms of limiting them or drawing them back, or, as some would hope, in some cases, overturning them altogether.
Let's expand on that a little bit more, because you say that the precedents of Roe versus Wade on the issue of abortion or Obergefell on same-sex marriage are not in immediate danger, but like you said, the expansion is. Explain a little bit more. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think a lot of progressives thought that history would continue to bend in their direction, and that these rights would continue to be expanded by the Supreme Court. Just stopping that process in its tracks is in and of itself, I think, inflaming a lot of folks on the left. Now the question is, could Roe be overturned? Could Obergefell be overturned? That's a much more challenging proposition. It requires not just the cultural and political changes that need to occur, but then it requires legislation in the states. It requires challengers to challenge that in the state court, or in the federal courts rather than in the state courts, and bring it all the way up to the Supreme Court, which would have to rule not just on the merits of the constitutional issue, but on the question of what we call stare decisis, whether old precedents should stand just for the sake of stability in the law.
Well, knowing that likely President Trump will appoint somebody who is a conservative, do you think, looking down the line here, do you think state Supreme Courts and state courts are going to eventually start to play more of a role?
Absolutely, because I think people challenging new state laws, restricting abortion or other issues of interest to the left, they'll become savvier in challenging those issues in state court. because when you challenge a law in state court under the state constitution, it can't be further appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. We're already seeing this in Iowa, where groups are challenging the new abortion restrictions under the state constitution. There'll be more and more efforts to have these cases decided before more hospitable state Supreme Courts rather than the federal Supreme Court.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, and certainly in the near future with everything leading up before the midterm elections. Adam White, Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Senator Richard Shelby says the U.S. and Russia don't need to be adversaries. The Republican from Alabama is leading a U.S. delegation to Moscow 2 weeks before the official summit of President Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We're hoping that coming out of the Putin-Trump meeting in Helsinki, it will be the beginning, maybe, of a new day. We will have to wait and see.
Shelby was joined on the trip by 5 fellow Republican senators. They met with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and with their counterparts in the Russian parliament. Former Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak is arrested on charges of theft and money laundering. The arrest comes 2 months after his coalition's shocking defeat in Malaysia's general election. The arrest is linked to more than $10 million having been transferred to his bank account. Razak is set to appear in court tomorrow. Lawmakers in Poland are working on a law that would ban abortions if the unborn child has an irreparable disability. The proposal has drawn hundreds of protesters. Pro-abortion activists gathered yesterday outside of Poland's parliament. They chanted, "We want choice, not terror." The bill will go through another revision before being presented to lawmakers for debate. Abortion in the majority Catholic country is heavily restricted. A group in Syria undercovers thousands of bodies in an area controlled until recently by ISIS. The activists with Human Rights Watch say they will need help preserving the evidence. The findings shed light on the atrocities committed by the militants near the city of Raqqa. Officials in Indonesia end the search for 164 bodies from a ferry that sank 2 weeks ago. The search's end was marked by prayers and a groundbreaking ceremony for a memorial inscribed with the victims' names. The tragedy occurred in one of the world's deepest lakes. Sonar systems found the boat at a depth of 1,500 feet. Heavy rains are complicating the multinational rescue of a boys' soccer team and their coach from a cave in Thailand.
Right. I mean, so you're dealing with darkness. You're dealing with water, you're dealing with mud. And I think the taxing on the body, too. So these guys have been working long days.
Officials say the Thai Navy SEALs and rescuers never lost hope the group would be found. The team and their coach went exploring in the cave after a soccer game when they were trapped. They were missing for 9 days and may have to exit with help from professional divers. The highest-ranking Catholic official to be convicted of covering up sex abuse is sentenced and avoids prison. The Archbishop of Adelaide, Australia, Philip Wilson, will spend at least 6 months of home detention for failing to report to police the repeated abuse of 2 altar boys in the 1970s. Wilson stepped down as Adelaide's Archbishop after he was convicted in May. The Vatican's cricket team leaves Rome today with the goal of strengthening interfaith relations across the UK. Their team begins the 12-day Light of Faith tour in the north of England, playing an opening match against the prestigious Stonyhurst College. The cricket team was founded in 2013 and is made up of young men who are studying for the priesthood. Coming up, we examine whether lawmakers will make any progress on immigration reform. And the president has a public disagreement with NATO allies ahead of their meeting next week. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. NATO's European allies are pushing back against criticism from President Trump. The president says several NATO members are not spending enough on their own defense budget, but countries like Norway say they've gone far beyond what was asked of them. President Trump is ratcheting up the pressure ahead of a high-profile NATO summit next week, telling the leaders of Norway, Belgium, Germany, and Canada they need to loosen their military purse strings. In a June letter sent to Norway's prime minister, the president criticized the country for underspending on defense, saying he understands the political pressures. Quote, "It will, however, become increasingly difficult to justify to American citizens why some countries continue to fail to meet our shared collective security commitments." The president warning if the countries don't spend at least 2% of their GDP on defense spending, he may have to adjust America's military presence. White House Press Secretary Sarah Sanders says the president is frustrated.
And they've made the commitment to do 2%. He'd like to see them fulfill that commitment. The United States has more than surpassed that and is carrying a lot of that burden.
The Norwegian defense minister is pushing back, saying his country has spent more on new military equipment than expected. But the White House says Norway still has not met the 2% agreement. The president's criticism is not new, as he's been calling out NATO allies throughout the past year.
Germany is paying 1% of a much smaller GDP. We're paying close to 4% of a much larger GDP. Now, that doesn't work, folks.
The issue will be one of many at next week's summit. It's the first major one since the G7 meeting in Canada last month, where European allies voiced concern over the president's trade tariffs. Not every European leader is playing up President Trump's letter. The Prime Minister of Belgium says the note he got from the White House was, quote, typical of the kind of issues brought up ahead of NATO meetings. Iran's president condemns President Trump's immigration and travel ban policies. Hassan Rouhani was speaking at a news conference today in Switzerland. He says the president's travel ban, recently upheld by the Supreme Court, is, quote, a religious discrimination policy, and adds the White House is wrong to separate families at the U.S.-Mexico border. He also reiterates Iran's commitment to the nuclear deal, saying his country's interests must be respected. The U.S. bishops have wrapped up their two-day visit to the border with Mexico. During yesterday's press conference, Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, president of the U.S. Bishops' Conference, says the process has started to reunite immigrant children with their families. DiNardo has called for the reunification of children as urgent. Joining me now is Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. Rachel, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
What needs to happen to reunite these families? Is this a legal issue or is it a procedural issue? What's happening here?
Well, right now it's kind of both. President Trump has said he is no longer going to separate families at the border. In addition, a judge in California ruled that families must be put back together. So the government is in the process of reuniting families, which were separated in part because of the zero tolerance policy at the border, but also in part of current law, which says that children cannot be held for more than 20 days. So while their parents' prosecution may take between 6 and 9 months, the children cannot be held at the border and must be placed in foster care, which is why you've seen some of these kids being taken as far as New York. So that reunification process has started. It will probably take a couple of months.
Do you think Congress needs to play a role in getting these families back together, or what do you think the role of Congress is in this?
Well, Congress conveniently has left town without addressing any of these issues. But there is a role for Congress to play here. First and foremost, the president doesn't have the resources to do what he's trying to do. So he's getting overwhelmed at the border, which is why he instituted the zero tolerance policy. But they don't have enough Border Patrol agents, judges, or beds to even hold these families. Now, if you want to hold families together, you need even more resources. So that's a question only Congress can address. The second issue is one of legal clarification. Can we hold children for more than 20 days? Should families be held together? What does all that look like? Only Congress can rewrite the law. They have to be the ones to do it.
And like you mentioned, Congress is not in town, gone for the 4th of July break. With them in recess now, when they come back, I guess I say, do you think they'll get immigration right back on their agenda? And do you think they can pass something quick?
Well, that would be the hope. There is a bill in the United States Senate authored by Senator Ted Cruz of Texas, joined by a number of Senate Republicans, and Democrats are blocking it. They tried to pass it right before the recess. Senator Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democrats, took to the Senate floor and said, no, we'd rather keep the president or the focus on President Trump. That's what he said on the Senate floor. They have no interest in passing this bill. So it remains to be seen if Congress will be able to get any solution across the finish line.
Well, obviously it's divided among Republicans and Democrats, but it also seems like Republicans have been divided on the immigration issue, specifically what kind of legislation should they pass. In your experience, what do you think needs to happen to really have comprehensive immigration reform? I mean, realistically.
Well, I think this is what we're seeing right now. We're seeing crisis at the border. We're seeing the country up in arms. There couldn't be more attention on this issue, and Congress is almost punting to some extent and refusing to want to deal with this. So I do think that as the more immigration plays a role in the upcoming midterm elections, I think you're going to elect members who are very focused on addressing this question. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a lot of hope for substantive reform before November.
Okay, we'll certainly be watching to see what they do before the midterm elections. Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, thanks so much for your analysis.
Thank you.
Up next, Pope Francis is headed to a town in Italy important to both Catholics and the Orthodox faithful. We have a preview. And the Vatican's firefighters do more than just extinguish flames. Welcome back. I'm Wyatt Goolsby, in for Lauren Ashburn. The head of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity says the Holy Father's upcoming trip to southern Italy will be focused on working together among different Christian faiths. Cardinal Kirk Koch spoke today at the Holy See press office about Saturday's visit to Bahri. He says the Middle East is the origin of Christianity and the Pope's trip is a unique opportunity for Christian unity. The Holy Father will meet from leaders from the Catholic and Orthodox churches based in the Middle East. A project run by Catholic priests offers Syrian and Iraqi refugee children the chance to go to school.
This is Fratelli.
The Fratelli Project is run by the Marist brothers and the De La Salle brothers in Lebanon. 70 refugee children are receiving an education. They're not allowed to attend Lebanon's state schools. Organizers say it is the first in a series of initiatives to help migrants. Finally tonight, did you know the Vatican has its own fire department? It does, and some of its most important tasks have nothing to do with ladders or putting out fires. Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley gives us a look at the unique group.
The Dome of St. Peter's Basilica towers above Vatican City, and if you look closely on some days, you'll see visitors at the top. It's a 600-step journey up steep and narrow stairs. If you suffer from heart problems or vertigo, a panic attack can set in, or worse. At that point, Allarme Cupola, or dome alert, kicks in, and a group of medical professionals, including firefighters, step in. Paolo De Angelis heads up the squad. De Angelis says dome alerts are extremely challenging, and carrying ailing pilgrims down the corkscrew stairwell is exhausting. But it's one of many non-fire-related tasks they tackle.
Headquartered here at the Belvedere courtyard in the heart of the Vatican, the Pope's firemen admit they don't put out a lot of fires, only about 20 a year. They usually spend their days managing flooded buildings or opening doors that have got stuck or even rescuing people trapped in elevators.
And when central Italy was rocked by a deadly earthquake in 2016, the Pope sent his firemen to help. Giuseppe Di Pasqua tells me helping the earthquake survivors impacted him more than anything else during his 11 years here, adding he hopes he managed to offer the victims a tangible sign of Christian charity. It might not be the world's most cutting-edge fire station, but a career here is highly prestigious. Fabio Di Canio joined the firefighters 26 years ago. It was my childhood dream to become a fireman, and I'm so proud, he tells me. We're called to protect the Vatican's heritage, and we have the good fortune of working close by the Holy Father. Not everyone is eligible for a papal firefighting career. You have to be between 21 and 25 years old, and your parish priest has to vouch for you. But if you land the job, surely one of the best perks is having none other than the Pope as your Commander-in-Chief. At the Vatican Fire Department, Juliet Lindley, EWTN News Nightly.
Thanks, Juliet, for that report. And that wraps up our newscast for tonight. Lauren Ashburn is back on the anchor desk tomorrow with a special edition of EWTN News Nightly. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We thank you for watching. Good night, and God bless.